When I was a little kid during the 90s, like everyone else in the world at that time, I idolized Michael Jordan. MJ was the ultimate alpha male: cool, confident, handsome, competitive, and powerful. Not only was he the greatest on the court, he was a global icon off it. Stories of his star power have since become stuff of legend. In his heyday, whenever he walked into a room, no matter who else was present, all eyes turned to him. And to this day, even in his 60s, MJ carries the same mystique. Jordan's legend and the mythology that surrounds him persists. The particular qualities that have come to define Jordan's persona, dominant and aggressive, unrelenting yet unmoved, are traits that most men aspire to attain. Yet many lament that such manly characteristics are today under attack, that modern feminism has stifled masculinity, labeling such attributes as harmful and corrupting. And, subsequently, the notion of toxic masculinity has become a hot topic indeed. Welcome to Stone Cold Moderation, a thinking man's journey toward a healthier relationship with alcohol. I'm your host, Chase Lee. Let's continue with our discussion. According to dictionary.com, toxic masculinity is a cultural concept of manliness that glorifies stoicism, strength, virility, and dominance, and that is socially maladaptive or harmful to mental health. So, where does the term come from? The phrase was coined during the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s, when the feminist movement sought to undermine traditional male authority. According to the mythopoetic men's movement, a feminized society was to blame for the so-called toxicity by denying men the ability to connect and develop their true masculine selves. Tendencies toward violence and aggression by men, therefore, were nothing more than collateral damage in this conflict. Since then, and especially in light of the Me Too movement, the phrase has made its way into our everyday vernacular and has permeated into pop culture. So, is it really a thing? Is it another case of liberal BS? And as it pertains to this conversation, how does alcohol come into play? All right, so topic of discussion today, of course, toxic masculinity. Let's talk about it. Did a little bit of background research. One of the very good articles that I found was from The Atlantic from February of 2019 by a gentleman called Michael Salter. The title of the article, The Problem with a Fight Against Toxic Masculinity, right? And basically, what this article sums up is that the origins of this term are a bit problematic. As I mentioned earlier, it was coined during the mythopoetic men's movement as a response to the feminist movement. And so the term toxic masculinity, it sort of assumes that there are innate good and bad traits that men possess, right? And like their argument was that because of the feminist movement, kind of we're not able men are not able to kind of develop their innately good traits, and that's problematic, right? It also seems that before the feminist movement, men were in some way faultless. That before the feminist movement, men were always noble and caring and nurturing and all of these quote unquote positive male traits. I think if you look at at history and any time period, you'll know that violence against women and rape has always existed. So problematic in that sense as well. Um, so Michael Salter goes on to explain that by blaming culture and just culture for the creation of toxic masculinity, it doesn't also consider the various social conditions that would be responsible for said toxic masculinity. For example, race, culture, sexuality, all of these social conditions that kind of, well, one, make up our understanding of gender and would impact the behavior of men in a given society. And indeed, ideas about masculinity are different in different cultures and different places in the world and during different time periods. And furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, this approach doesn't consider the possibility that gender is a social construct, that in fact the quote unquote two genders don't have innate traits, and that in fact we create those perceptions. I'm not going to get into all that because that's a bit above my pay grade, but this was a really interesting article by Michael Salter, and it does, even though it does bring up the kind of problematic origins of the term toxic masculinity, it does, of course, concede that and support the belief that the problems that are facing it speaks to some very real problems in the world and dangers that are facing women today, especially at the hands of men. So what do I think? I very much like the definition from dictionary.com, operative words in that definition being socially maladaptive or harmful to mental health. And I think in this situation, context is really important, and context is everything, right? For example, a situation where you're at a party and some guy gets up on the table and takes off his shirt and pounds his chest and cracks open a beer on his head and then finishes it, right? Most would say that's a pretty manly display, right, of dominance in that situation, correct? Is that in itself toxic masculinity? I don't necessarily think so. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Although that's certainly not healthy, the binge drinking aspect to that, and socially maladaptive, perhaps. Harmful to mental health, perhaps. But that sort of display might not necessarily in itself be toxic masculinity. Now, if this individual does that, and that points at some other guy across the room and says, okay, you better do the same thing or else you're a pussy, right? That's toxic masculinity. Okay? I think. Because that's certainly socially maladaptive, and that's damaging. And that's damaging to the people, to the person who's getting called out. That's certainly not a positive experience for other people in the room. I think that's toxic masculinity. So I think in these situations there is room for context. Context is everything, and there is room for nuance. And I think in how the term is used today, and especially in bringing to light and denouncing real issues that face women, domestic violence, rape culture, and kind of exposing this culture that is certainly dangerous, not only to women, but also to men and to everybody in society, really. I think that the way in which it's used today is quite effective and important. I think it's important to understand and accept the fact that men and women do not live in the same world. We don't really occupy some of the same spaces. A lot of women, I think, and if in conversations with friends and family, it's clear to me that most women spend a large portion of their life feeling unsafe around their male colleagues, feeling unsafe when they walk down the streets. Yes. And typically men don't face those problems. I don't have to when if I want to go in my neighborhood, walk around in the evening, I'm not worried about somebody attacking me. Um, when I'm on public transportation, I'm not worried about being harassed sexually. It's just not something that I have to be conscious about. And certainly, attacks against men, sexual assault does happen towards men, but it happens towards women a lot more in this society that we live in today. And I really don't think you can dispute that. And I don't think you should try. Um, so, on an unrelated note, but sort of related, I also have been kind of alarmed and fascinated by this culture of assuming false victimhood as it pertains to like gender relations. So, for example, like I watch a lot of YouTube, too much YouTube, and I see all the time. For example, if there's a clip of like a movie scene where I don't know, like the woman is like cheating on the man or something, or the woman in a relationship, like the woman is treating like the man badly in some way, and there's always just this wild like outpouring of comments from men who are talking about like, yeah, like that's what women do, and like stuff like this, and like that's why you can never trust a woman, this kind of attitude. And I'm like, and I find it all over social media, like on a constant basis. And that's something that men really need to stop doing, because we need to stop living under the impression that we live in a world in which we suffer, systemic micro and macro aggression at the hands of women. It's just not true. In fact, it's the opposite. We live in a world where men are the perpetrators of violent acts towards women on a constant basis, much more than vice versa. So that's something that has definitely alarmed me, especially recently. But I guess this, in a greater scheme, on a greater scope, like the culture of claiming false victimhood, that's such a problem, not only as it pertains to gender, but, race and class and all of these things, and which we're not going to get into just in this episode. But yeah, I've noticed that and not a huge fan of it. So wrapping things up, at least for this first part, my conclusion is that masculinity itself is not under attack. Okay, or our idea of manhood and masculinity not under attack, but the attitudes and the systems that perpetrate violence against women certainly are. And if this term of toxic masculinity is going to be sort of like a tool that illuminates those issues for people, right, then fine. I think it's positive, and I think we can live with that. Even if the term toxic masculinity, as I've talked about today, comes from sort of dubious origins and is not in itself perfect. All right, moving right along. So, how does alcohol play into all of this? Um, Alcohol can certainly exacerbate violent behavior and aggressive behavior. Although it's not the root cause of it necessarily, it certainly can amplify it and make things worse. I'm actually going to do at some point a full episode on alcohol and violence, and namely sexual violence. Not today, but there's actually a lot of scientific research to support that. So the presence of alcohol can certainly exacerbate situations in which toxic masculinity, quote unquote, is taking place. And I think we can all imagine a million examples of that. And I think many of us have experienced instances of that. And in a more general sense, right? Kind of this idea that connects manliness and alcohol together. This idea that, a man can hold his liquor if for whatever reason you can't or you don't want to, you're less of a man. That's quite problematic, right? And in fact, a lot of women, I think, try to live up to those standards as well, because there are certain social rewards for being a man who can hold his liquor, and then just being anyone who can drink a lot. There's a lot of kind of, yeah, there's social rewards and some sort of admiration that comes with that. Okay. Okay. So moving on to our interview, I have a very special guest today. Her name is Caitlin Padgett, and she is the founder of her organization called Redefining Sobriety, and is also the author of a book called Drink Less, Be More. Very lucky to have her on today. Spent some time with her a few days ago talking about a number of things, namely toxic masculinity, and so this was our conversation. Okay, so yes, I am here today with Caitlin Padgett, who is the founder of Redefining Sobriety, and her book, which is Drink Less, Be More. Caitlin, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So, just to start out, you have a really interesting story. You've done a lot of different things, moved around a lot in the world. So, if you could just give I don't know, like a brief introduction, kind of tell your story and talk about what you do, where you are right now.
Sure. So I'll try to make it
Yeah.
brief, as you said. It is a bit hard as I've had a lot of adventures. But I'm originally Canadian. I grew up on the west coast of Canada in a small town, where as a teenager there were very limited options. We were considered a really high risk place just in terms of socioeconomic status, like access to different kinds of programs and extracurriculars and stuff like that. So we kind of like topped the charts for a lot of things like drug use and teen pregnancy, and like we won all the kind of the bad awards. And so for me, that also impacted my teenage years, and I got into using alcohol and drugs at a fairly young age. As a way of just kind of escaping some challenging circumstances as well within my own life. And then I would say that it just really carried on for me into my 20s. And I very much lived a work hard, play hard lifestyle. So I was really accomplished in a lot of ways, and I excelled at a lot of things and had a really cool career by the time I was in my early 20s, and then started working internationally and traveling all over the place. But I didn't have a very good ability to take care of myself through that. And alcohol and drugs, to a certain extent, for quite a while, were kind of like my escape. And also my way of taking time off. Like if I was hungover, that would be my permission to do nothing for a day where I didn't know how to slow down. Like I didn't really know how to give myself breaks or take good care of myself or feel the things that I was, needing to feel. It was just always go, 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 go. And that all kind of came to a head in my late 20s when I was at the time living in Cambodia. As I said, I'd had already kind of an international career working as a drug policy consultant and a human rights advocate. And my life was falling apart. I was going through a divorce. I was really unhealthy, really unhappy. And it was what I would call my bottom, although at the time I didn't really see it like that. And I moved from Cambodia to Mexico, where my dad lived. And my idea at the time was I just didn't want to move back to Canada. I didn't really know what to do with my life. I knew I needed to make some changes. And on the way over here, I made a decision, to stop using the drugs I was using and throw out the sleeping pills and all. I was using different pharmaceutical things for anxiety and sleep. And then the alcohol piece was one that was really hard for me, harder than I thought. Even though at times I tried to take breaks, I really realized that there was a lot of deeper work for me to do around that. And that work really led me into what I do now, which is coaching women who are high achieving, really accomplished women, but who struggle with alcohol. So the past 7 years, 6, 7 years of my life have really been devoted to my own healing and really developing a very harm reduction, because that's the work I used to do, kind of harm reduction, risk and harm minimization approach to alcohol, cutting out the parts that we don't like or redefining the parts that we don't like, while also potentially leaving room for still having the aspects that we do like. And I wrote the book that you mentioned, Drink Less, Be More, How to Have a Great Night and Life Without Getting Wasted. And my program has evolved into something that I now call Redefining Sobriety, which is the idea that really we all get to decide what our definition of sobriety is. And so it's redefining alcohol or whatever you turn to for distraction on your own terms. So that was that
Yeah.
was my attempt at being brief. I don't know if I was, but
No, amazing. Yeah.
thanks.
You've obviously done a lot, and I was just wondering if you could just give another like brief introduction to like what do you do to help clients? Like, what is kind of your method or your approach?
Yeah, so I have a variety of different ways that I work with my clients right now. The most intensive and I would say integrated way is through my private coaching. And also, I have a long term group program. So, with private coaching, it's the 6 month intensive. Basically, we meet 2 times a month and we have unlimited email and voice support, voice message support in between our sessions. And the idea is that you really have somebody who's there in your corner, cheering you on, championing you, calling you on your bullshit, all of that accountability for 6 months. I also have a small group program that is 9 months long, which is also a very comprehensive container for making really big change and transition in your life. And then I have a short program, which is 8 weeks long, which is another redefining sobriety group program, which is really just, it helps give you some of the tools and the strategies in the day-to-day of how to reassess your relationship with alcohol. All of them start with you really defining what you want what your vision for your ideal relationship to alcohol is, and getting really clear on if I could have my ideal relationship to alcohol, what would that look like? What has alcohol brought me in my life? What needs are being met through alcohol, or what needs do I believe that I need alcohol to meet? And then really getting nuanced about each person's individual plan from there. And the shorter programs really just focus a lot, because there's only so much you can do in 8 weeks, but they're really about strategy. It's about like, okay, so I know what my vision is now. I know kind of what needs to change. How do I implement different strategies and accountability so that I am able to actually follow through on that instead of disappointing myself or falling back into old habits or patterns? The longer individual work or the longer group program really focus on healing from the inside out, and also doing that deep work to really understand what our triggers are, to really understand where we might self-sabotage or start abandoning ourselves again. Because for a lot of us, these relationships, our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to alcohol and or other things like our perfectionism or overwork, or they're also interconnected, and they start from a very young age. So in a lot of ways, we have to go back and heal things that we may not have looked at or really even acknowledged from quite a young age, and then realize that as adults now we actually have a very different way of taking care of ourselves. We just need to remember how, and remind ourselves that we can do that. We can love and nurture ourselves differently than the way we became used to over the years.
Yeah. So, last was it last week? A couple
Yeah,
days
well,
ago.
it was. I feel like we're just in this extended time warp right now
Yeah.
with,
Yeah, and I'm
with
like,
the pandemic.
yeah, and I'm like in quarantine right now myself, so I have no idea what day it is. But a couple days ago, we were on a panel discussion,
Yeah.
and you brought up the topic of toxic masculinity, and the
Hmm.
idea that like some of your clients who you work with, who like you said are these high achieving women, very successful in their jobs, but struggle with alcohol, and this idea that the need to like keep up with the boys, sort of in those professional and social situations, was something that was really kind of damaging to them and kind of an obstacle that they had to kind of get over. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. So just first of all, what is your
Hmm.
kind of your definition of toxic masculinity?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So for me, I think, obviously masculinity and femininity both exist on spectrums, and there are really positive aspects to both. And I think when I think of toxic masculinity, I really think of the hyper masculinity, or the things that we really celebrate about masculinity, but taken to the extreme. So while we might look to men and appreciate their strength, for example, hyper masculinity or toxic masculinity then takes it like into aggression and violence, and it's really societies and our cultures idea of manhood and masculinity that boys have been really unconsciously, I think, and not just boys are raised with it, but we all are unconsciously conditioned around what, what we celebrate in masculinity, and the toxicity in it, and the part that makes it harmful is that it really is damaging to men and also to women and also to children, because it cuts men off from accessing their softer parts, for example, their emotionality, their sensitivity, their ability to express certain parts of themselves, and only focuses on, or they believe that they can only be a certain way, which is, no emotions, domineering, and, aggressive. Maybe their own emotion is anger, that's their default. And unfortunately, it's really damaging, not just for men, but for everyone, because we all, in different ways, we're also interconnected, obviously. And then, we all, I think, as a culture, are really suffering from the fact that men have been raised in this particular way that favors certain qualities or certain experiences of manhood over others, and defavorizes femininity and the connection to the feminine, and all that comes along that. We celebrate masculine qualities and we put down feminine qualities, and it's really insidious. It permeates everything without us really even being aware of how much is influenced by that.
Yeah, and so how then does alcohol consumption and perhaps alcohol abuse um, kind of make things worse? Or I guess, what is the interplay between toxic masculinity and alcohol?
So there's so many ways, and again, I would say probably on a spectrum of lower harm to a lot of harm. I mean, and let's just talk briefly about a lot of harm, and then I think we should go into maybe the lower harm ways that are unconscious, but that maybe some of your listeners might cause them to reflect on their own lives and ways of interacting. But obviously some of the really extreme examples, and I was going to say obvious, maybe it's not so obvious, but there's actually been studies that have shown that in areas that have more alcohol stores and liquor stores also have higher rates of domestic violence and abuse. There's correlations between alcohol use and rape or non-consensual sex. There's all of those kinds of examples that maybe we hear about, more often in the media, and that have been studied and researched. So, and that has, like I said, that's been researched and it exists. I think in a lot of other ways that are maybe less obvious, but can still be really harmful, are, the sort of bro culture, or the celebration of, in like, let's say a high school party where, again, if you're getting all of these messages that being a certain kind of person is celebrated, and there's drinking games, you're going to want to keep up. Well, I'm going to say like, this happened to me, and I think it still happens. Like, I wanted to keep up with the guys. I would be playing drinking games because I would be praised then for being a part of that dynamic, and I would be praised for how much I could drink and being able to keep up. And I mentioned this on the panel we were on. I'm a small person in a small frame, and I don't weigh a lot. And like, the idea even that I should be able to drink as much as guys, and that's something that we learn more about that when we're young than we learn about the fact that as women we actually metabolize alcohol differently, and it just should never even be a thing to try to drink as much as men. Like, it's really harmful. And then you think about that carrying on into college environments, you think about that carrying on into workplaces, and I have clients who work in finance, I have clients who are lawyers, and they talk about the culture around going out for drinks or meeting with clients, and this expectation that you are there and you're drinking as much as your male colleagues, or you're entertaining your clients and therefore drinking with your clients, and often your clients are men. So it's this continuation of this culture that I think in a lot of ways starts quite young, and it's never questioned. And I have clients who are it's so difficult because they value their work, they want to do a good job, and yet it's like they're poisoning themselves, or having these harmful outcomes, feeling hungover, not feeling at their best, just really struggling around their alcohol use, and yet their workplace is completely 100% condoning that level of alcohol use and misuse. And it's really challenging for them to see how to take a step back while part of the job is considered to be the drinking part of the job, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and you saying that makes me kind of reflect a bit on my own experiences. Like I definitely, especially in college. I mean, college, like yeah, college is such an insidious environment for that because there's all of these kind of like college isms. At least in like North America, and the drinking culture, the culture of drinking games, for example,
Mm-hmm.
where yeah, like all the girls are like expected to and praised when they keep up with the boys, and how ridiculous that is. And I'm thinking of like my own memories, and yeah, it's crazy that we did all that, and that we kind of existed in that environment and like
And we
let
don't
that kind
even
of be.
really,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and like we don't even really question it. And actually, I think I even took it as an insult, like as opposed to just really sound medical advice and like basic biology for somebody to say to me when I was younger, like, hey, you know what? Like, you don't have to keep up with the guys. It might affect you differently. There was a certain point in my life where I was so conditioned into that reality that I would have taken that as an insult. I've been like, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about, kind of thing. like like biology, schmology, I I actually believed that I could and should be drinking as much as my male counterparts because I was so deep in that. And and it wasn't until many years later when I really started researching this and understanding the impact that this had had on my own life, and really realizing that like the harm I was doing and we were doing to each other, and that this is not just somebody trying to put me down, by saying I can't drink as much as the guys. There's actually really real reasons why this is harmful to me and my body, and that I should never be expected to drink as much as the guys. But like you were saying, like it's just so like we're so deeply programmed around it that we don't even question it, or we even take it as a negative, like an insult, like a demerit. That I can't. You're trying to tell me I can't drink as much as the guys? What? You know?
Yeah. So what did you do in your own life, and like how do you advise clients this, like specifically in this matter, to kind of when they're in situations where they feel the pressure to keep up with the boys, so to speak, how do they overcome that? How do they start to
That's such a good question. And it's obviously something that doesn't happen overnight. But a concept that I write about in my book, and that I would say I embody and I coach my clients around as well, is acting as if. So it's this idea that even if in this time between, let's say today, when you make a decision that you're not going to drink as much in certain environments, and the time, let's say 3 months from now, where it actually feels easier to be in that environment, and you've changed your habits and you've changed your mindset around it and your way of being, there's going to be a transition period that's challenging. It feels uncomfortable. You're doing something different, and you haven't actually, you're not on the other side yet. But what you can do from here until then is act as if. Get really clear on how you want to be. Again, it's so important to have a vision. So imagine yourself and get really specific. So if you know that one of your problematic areas for drinking is this working environment or this social environment, we're kind of focusing on work, but the same thing goes for going out socially with a mixed group of people, or somewhere where that there's going to be guys, or you might be interested in someone, or whatever. Like if you're used to hanging out in bars and nightlife and there being alcohol involved, get really clear on what your ideal situation would be, whether that's with your colleagues or your clients, or somebody you're interested in dating, or just a social scene, or whatever it is. Get super clear on what you think your ideal situation would look like and how many drinks that would involve. And then start acting as if, imagine yourself as that confident person. Imagine yourself still nailing that client relationship, or getting them to whatever needs to happen for them to feel like they want to move forward with working with you, that all the positive things can happen, and that you're embodying the qualities of that person who also makes that happen. Because the thing is that you don't actually need the alcohol to be that person. You've just over the years come to think that the two are inextricably linked, but they're not. And what I've really realized, and a lot of my clients have found as well, is that you can still show up and be that person. It might feel awkward in the beginning, and that's why I say act as if. You might feel like you're pretending. You might feel like you're not quite that confident person that yet without the alcohol, but you can be. And it takes practice, and it takes you showing up and kind of putting yourself in a way in some of those environments, and keeping the vision on how you want to be once you've shifted that part of your relationship to alcohol. And then it even includes things like, I often suggest, especially if you're in an environment where you're not sure if you can necessarily turn down a drink and be obvious about it right away without getting some flack for it. Go talk to the bartender, tell him to stop pouring alcohol into your, just say, look, I'm trying not to drink, or I have to drive tonight. These guys are buying me drinks. Where there's, can you make sure that mine doesn't have alcohol in it? Or just going and ordering something yourself and having it be something that looks like a cocktail, but it's sparkling water with lime, so that you have something in your hand. And a lot of times people don't even really notice, and they're not going to pay as much attention. And if they are, and if they're insistent, then at least you've kind of, and a lot of bartenders are really good at supporting in that way. So you just kind of have to be proactive about it and think of some different strategies to get you through those initial situations where you're not really sure how to navigate the not drinking, or how to turn down a drink or say no to it. In a way, it's kind of like just, keeping up the appearances until you're in a place where you feel stronger and confident. And then you can maybe approach the topic of like, you haven't been drinking as much, or you feel, decide what the sort of the part two of the conversation is going to be with the people around you.
Yeah, it's a tricky kind of situation. I'm imagining, like, for example, let's say there's these coworkers who are at the bar, right? Somebody, one of them is, I don't know, clients who are trying to, or somebody, one group is trying to sign this group to be their clients or whatever, and one group buys other like tequila shots, right? And in that situation, like, turning down that drink can be seen as like rude, and can be seen as counterproductive to like getting the deal, for example. And that can be, I feel like that can be a real challenge for people. So I guess my question would be, like, in those situations, what can guys do to kind of be more understanding, to limit their, I guess, toxicity in those situations, and effectively change the culture?
I love that question. And I think it's really important, first and foremost, this is why I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation, is to acknowledge that men are raised in a way that favors their privilege or their dominance over women. And women are raised in a way, and I'm making generalizations here, of course, but like, this is sort of like the cultural norm. And women are raised in a way where it's hard for us to say no. Where we're taught to people, and it's hard for us especially to say no to men and to people in authority positions. So that in and of itself, I think, is a really important awareness to have at first. And know that in certain situations, you might think that you're just being nice, or just doing the right thing by saying, like, can I get you a drink? Or let me buy, it's not even a question often, let me buy you a drink, what are you drinking? And it's just this assumption that you're going to buy the drink for the woman, and that the woman's going to say yes, and there's been so many times when I've said yes when I didn't really want to, in a variety of different situations, because it's really hard. We're not raised to feel comfortable. And then you mix some alcohol in there, and it gets even less easier to say no sometimes. So I think, you know, I was thinking about this morning. I think even I love it, for example, especially now that I've really changed my relationship to alcohol. But like, if a guy is a non-drinker, or if a guy offers me something that's not alcoholic, or notices that I'm not drinking an alcoholic drink and like shows up with that drink, like for me, that's so it's so respectful, and I feel so seen, and I feel so supported. And in a way, it's like allowing you to be the man, to do all the things that men I think really want to be, like a provider and respectful and really showing up and supporting a woman, taking care of a woman. It checks all the boxes in a way more than if they were trying to be chivalrous by like buying me an alcoholic drink. You know what I mean? So I think for men to really first and foremost notice and know that it's hard for women sometimes, even very accomplished, powerful, successful women, it's hard for us in certain situations sometimes to say no. Just knowing that is really important. Then being careful about how you frame your question, like, hey, like, you start off with some, I don't know, like, let's just maybe get some waters first so that we're all hydrated, or like you can take the lead in making it not be an alcoholic drink that's the first thing that we're all drinking, or that the person you're buying a drink is drinking. you know Checking in with the person and asking them if they drink or if they don't drink, and I think immediately offering the option for it to be an either or, not the assumption that it's going to be an alcoholic drink, so then it gives the other person the opportunity to be like, oh, actually, no, you know what, I'd really like a sparkling water. Oh, they've got some really cool mocktails on this menu. Maybe I'll try that. I think taking away the immediate assumption or the immediate offer for it to be something alcoholic would also be really helpful. And then, yeah, like if you're in this kind of hosting environment, making sure that there's always water or there's always other options available, because there's also been so many times when I've been at work-related events and networking events, and it's really hard to find something that doesn't have alcohol in it to drink. So just being a good and caring host, to make sure that there's always options available that don't have alcohol in it, so that people don't have to go out of their way or out of their comfort zones to search for those options.
Yeah, and I think so much of what kind of dictates how men behave in these situations is trying to impress women, right? Just being perfectly honest. At
Mm-hmm.
least heteronormative straight men in these situations is to impress girls. And I think the understanding that if we're creating this culture of coerciveness and this toxic situation, if you have to drink or else, is we're really not doing ourselves any favors in that situation, right? And I think understanding that is important. And I think we're all.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, no, I'd like maybe finish your thought, and then I was going to say something else.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there was something also, so the first time you and I met or kind of were on a call together was a while ago on that Sober Leaders call. And I was struck by something you were saying about, because we're talking about from a men's perspective, around dating and sexuality and, how alcohol ties into all of that. And I think it was you were talking about sort of the pressure around meeting women, and the sort of lack of confidence sometimes, and how, as men or in certain environments come to learn that alcohol kind of helps you get what you want or be the person you think you need to be in those social environments or in dating. And it was really interesting because it seems so obvious to me, as we say it right now. But I remember at the moment thinking, yeah, I never really think that much about what it's like on the other side of things, right? And so it was interesting for me to hear you talk about that on that call that we were on a while ago. And then reflecting on your question here and what can we do moving forward. And yeah, I mean, I think really thinking again, it comes down to what you think you need alcohol for and how you're trying to show up. And if it's really, well, I want to meet someone, or I want to impress, a woman, or I want to come across in a certain way, then taking what I just said a few moments ago around like, well, actually, I can speak from my personal experience now of what it really feels like for me to actually feel really seen and really supported and really taken care of. And, I think when there's too much alcohol involved, it's hard to really see another person. It's hard to really pay attention to what they might need or help them feel taken care of. And if somebody, like, I'm just thinking, if I was in an environment now, and let's say you were there and you wanted to impress me, like if you showed up with like another one of the non-alcoholic drinks that I was drinking, that I hadn't even said out loud what I was drinking, but that you'd kind of noticed, and you went to the bartender and you asked what it was and you came back with that, or you made sure that there was another round of water, you know, then I would feel really noticed and really, really impressed and really taken care of. And I would think, wow, this person's really confident also. Like he's putting himself out there in a certain way to make sure that I'm also noticing.
Yeah.
And so I think that those are like some tips for people who are listening to this that maybe, to take into consideration.
Yeah, because and I think the point I was trying to make during that conversation was like, so often, more often than not, the alpha male status being in some ways socially dominant is more often than not rewarded, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
think and it's really easy for us to fall into that trap and fall into that culture and lose perspective and sort of lose the awareness of like, if we're damaging people in social settings, we're not doing ourselves any favors, right? But it's really easy for us to fall
Yeah.
into that trap.
And it's so easy, and you don't mean to do it. I think that's the thing. It's there's so much unconscious conditioning that's happening on both sides. And I mean, for me, that's one of the reasons too, because it is so easy to slide back into those roles. And that's why I'm also all for, whether or not you are sober or want to cut alcohol out completely, or if you're moderating, or whatever your goals are around alcohol. I mean, now that we're kind of on the topic of, dating or just getting to know other people, I think dates or social activities, ways to connect that just don't have alcohol involved are so important, because we really do pay attention to other people and what's going on, and really do listen, and can get such a much a better sense of who somebody is and whether we're interested in them, or maybe we're just interested in a friendship. But like, things become so much more clear so much more quickly. And so whatever your personal goals are or your relationship is to alcohol, I just think in general, with really connecting with other human beings, and really being aware of our roles and how we show up and how we want to show up. Or maybe you notice yourself falling back into an old way of being with someone, you're like, but your ability to even notice that, and how you might be playing into a certain role that's outdated. Now you're like, I want to evolve beyond this. I don't want to be that guy, or I don't want to be that girl, that woman anymore. Your ability to even pay attention to yourself and show up for yourself differently is so different if you're not mixing alcohol, into the picture. So I think it's just, right now at this moment in time also, where we're all craving real connection. I've been thinking about it too, because clients of mine, like so many of these Zoom calls that they've been having with their friends or their peers, their families or whatever, are involving alcohol. And it's just really so interesting to me how, like, just, and, you know, think that that's what we need in order to be connecting. Like, you're just sitting in front of your computer. You're not even in real life with people. You don't need to have a drink to be able to socialize. And yet it's this unconscious, like, immediate connection. Like, oh, we're having our virtual happy hour, or we're having our whatever, our meetup, and that everybody has to have a drink in hand somehow.
Zoom call.
So even on
Yeah, no, sorry. I was gonna say Zoom
no,
calls
it's
with
okay.
alcohol, like that gives me so much anxiety. I did that once and it was terrible. I'm like, I'm never doing this again. It was horrible. I hated it. Sorry, I
Zoom
interrupted you.
socializing and no, that's okay. Zoom socializing in general gives me
Yeah.
anxiety. Like I have some of my clients have had so many of these calls, and my family has Zoom calls, and I haven't been, I think I went to like the last 5 minutes of one of my family Zoom calls, and yeah, it's so I guess maybe that's why people are using alcohol. Maybe it gives other people anxiety too, and
Yeah.
and they're drinking to feel more comfortable.
It's very strange times that we're living in.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah.
So on the topic, you talked a little bit about moderation and whatnot. I wanted to give you a
Hmm.
few moments definitely to talk a bit about your book, Drink Less, Be More, and then maybe talk about more about your organization, Redefining Sobriety. I know that's a lot, but yeah, I was curious.
Yeah, thank you. So my book really does, in a lot of ways, well, it's more focused towards women because that's the majority of who I've worked with. But I have had some men read my book and find it online and say that it's been really helpful for them. So it really does focus on this idea of the fact that we can still go out. Again, might look a little bit different in these times that we're in. Um, but that you can still show up and be you, be extroverted, be a social person, go out dancing, do all the fun things you like to do without as much alcohol involved. And it gives a lot of different strategies and support and client examples and testimonials in terms of how to do that. And it's not only about what happens when you're out in that social environment, but of course how you're taking care of yourself, what your even your nutrition looks like. It's really kind of a holistic perspective on how to change your relationship to alcohol if you're somebody who drinks, and has had problematic drinking more in the social environment. That's who it's meant for, the book, which for the most part was my own experience, except for when it got really bad towards the end. But it was much more the kind of drinking to excess when I was in certain work or social environments. So there's lots of really helpful strategies in the book. And it's an easy read too. I didn't want it to be really challenging. So it has really good information and is well researched, but it's also not going to bog you down. And there's action, items kind of at the end of each chapter also to help you integrate and implement the information. And then if anyone's interested who's listening, my round of my group program for Redefining Sobriety is, I run it every fall. So that's the 8-week program. So that's coming up. I'm not sure when this is going to air, but the group program happens every fall, sometimes in the spring, depending on how much interest there is. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a really good way to just really get very clear with yourself about what your relationship to alcohol is, what it has been, what you want it to be, and create your own self-defined plan for changing that relationship and moving closer to the relationship that you do want with alcohol and with yourself ultimately, which is what it's really about.
Awesome. Yeah, and I haven't read your book yet, but it is second on my list, so I'm excited to get to that.
What's first?
Yeah. Sober Curious. I don't know if you've heard of that
Oh,
by Ruby Warrington.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I follow her on Instagram too.
Yeah.
I'd like to read it. I haven't read it yet, but I think there's also probably a lot of parallels with a lot of the folks that I that I work with, and the sober curious community.
Yeah, for sure. Did you want to give out any social media contacts, websites? How do we find you?
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram at Redefining Sobriety, and also my website is redefiningsobriety.com. So pretty easy
All right.
to find me.
Awesome.
Those are the two best places. Yeah.
For sure. Okay, thank you so much, Caitlin Padgett, for being here today with us. Please stay on the line so we can chat a little bit more. But I just want to
Sure.
thank you again. All right, excellent stuff. Yeah, first of all, just super happy that I could have Caitlin along for that conversation. I had been wanting to talk about that for a while. And this is definitely not a topic that I'm just going to talk about once. It's definitely something that will come up again in the future, hopefully. But super glad I got to have a conversation with someone with a really interesting perspective and a lot of experience working with other women on that subject. So just quick reaction to her to that conversation. Some things that stood out to me. Yeah, I was really kind of taken aback when she said, our society honors masculine qualities, just in a very general sense, and sort of puts down and de-emphasizes feminine qualities. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, and that's really kind of fascinating to think about, right? So I guess these quote unquote masculine qualities, strength, power, dominance, even like extroversion, right, and even um, being very socially powerful and outgoing. Those are qualities that are honored by society and are often rewarded. And quote unquote feminine qualities, empathy, compassion, sensitivity, perhaps just passivity in a more general sense. Those are, I would say, qualities that are not rewarded by society. They don't really get you anywhere. I think that's what she was referring to, and definitely individuals who kind of like subvert that, women who take on more, I guess, who possess more masculine traits. They're quote unquote, bossy. They're driven. They're ambitious. Tend to get attacked for that, right? And men who possess more feminine traits get definitely in this society put down and shunned. Generally speaking, these are massive generalizations you can understand, but I think there's a lot of truth into what she was saying. And yeah, just the fact that and this I really had never thought about, that women in the society and girls are raised in a way in which they are instructed to not say no, or that it's very difficult for them to say no and kind of stand up for themselves, right? Because they're, I guess, taught to be passive and taught that is something that will be advantageous to them, which is really problematic in just a plethora of ways, but especially as it pertains to this conversation, and alcohol and potentially risky situations. That it can be very difficult for men to say no, certainly, to and submit to peer pressure, but particularly difficult for women in a lot of these situations. And that's something I really had never thought of before or considered, and I found that really really profound. Discussing the topic of alcohol in particular, I really liked the strategy of acting as if, and I'm definitely going to steal that. So, for example, if you're trying to come up with a plan for how you're not going to, or you're going to cut down for the next month or so, and acting as if you're somebody who already has this under control, who already knows what they're doing, right? So when you go to the bar, you have your plan and you act like you've already done this before, right? Faking it till you make it, right? Because as she said, coming into this situation, you're starting something new, you're challenging yourself. You might not feel very confident. And as I've talked about on this program many times, that's something that has to be kind of built and cultivated over time. But yeah, like the idea of faking it until you make it in this sort of situation, I think could definitely work. That's definitely a really great strategy. Yeah, so I'm gonna steal that. All right, final thoughts for this episode. Yeah, I just want to make something really clear. I am all for, from time to time, just unbridled and aggressive displays of masculinity, right? So there's a time and a place, right? So a slam dunk in traffic and then pounding your chest after. Not that I ever did that. All for it, love it. You're at a party and you rip your shirt off and then you do a keg stand. Awesome. I'm okay. I can't support that any because I think the that kind of consumption of alcohol is dangerous and harmful. That's why I'm doing this podcast, but you get what I'm saying. In itself, I don't think those kinds of actions are harmful. So what's the difference? Again, I think intention and context is important. If you are doing certain actions in order to intimidate or otherwise damage or cause harm to others, then we can qualify those actions as toxic masculinity. Okay, but there's definitely a time and a place to, ridiculous behavior and to be aggressive and to let the animal out, for lack of a better term there. But again, context is important. Intent is important. So along that line, I want to at least try to offer like some solutions to what people can do to sort of make these situations better. Allyship, not being afraid to start calling people out. If somebody in your group is, and this is for men or women, somebody in your group is doing something disrespectful, clearly, trying to cause harm or put down somebody else in the group, being toxic, not being afraid to call them out. And I know that can be very uncomfortable, and I understand that nobody is perfect and that, nobody is an angel. And as I'm saying this, I'm sure that in the future at some point I will behave badly and I will offend somebody for something I say or do. But not being afraid to at least start calling people out and start to have these conversations, I think can really make a big difference. And I definitely, just personally, I appreciate when I have behaved badly in the past, when people have approached me and said, that's not cool, like, chill out. I definitely have appreciated that. And there's a certain way of doing that. And again, it's approaching somebody as an adult in a mature manner and saying, you need to calm down. That's not cool. Doesn't have to be a big thing, but I think sort of setting some limits and setting some boundaries about what is appropriate and what is not. Because yes, a lot of damage can be done to people in these situations, right? On that note, setting high standards, right? I've kind of said this before. It's about setting high standards for yourself, and also, setting standards for the people around you. Who is going to be in your what kind of people do you want to surround yourself with, and what are kind of going to be the terms of engagement within your group of friends, right? And setting standards and holding everybody accountable to live up to those standards. I think there's a lot of strength in that, and there's a lot of progress that can be made. Okay, and finally, last but not least, listening to people's stories. Because like I mentioned earlier, I firmly believe that every woman out there, I can't imagine there not being many, every woman out there has a story of a time where she felt in physical danger because of a man, perhaps in sexual danger because of a man, if that's a term, and it happens on a daily basis. And everybody, I don't have any proof of this, but so many women out there who you'll talk to, people, your friends, people in your family, everyone has a story. Okay. And I think listening to those stories and taking those reflections seriously, that can be a major step forward to creating a better culture. Malala Yousafzai once said, "I raise my voice not so that I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard." This has been the Stone Cold Moderation Podcast with Chase Lee. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out the complete show notes of this episode on stonecoldmoderation.com, where you can learn more about us. For access to more content, please subscribe to our YouTube channels Check us out on all other social media platforms and make sure to tune in next time. We'll be talking about the impact of alcohol in Black communities.